Hello, everybody. I'm actually going to share my screen right away with you, other than saying hello to everybody. And I'm really excited to be here today. So let me just do that. I'm going to start with my slide screen and make it full screen because I've got everything on slides. So, Alicia, you confirm you can see that real well? Is that clear to everybody? I think she probably muted, but.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, good. So here we are getting started. You've got the title, and I put the other information up. I think these slides will be made available to you, or else we're actually recording it. So I'll just go ahead. I decided to dig back in my pictures. My wife took this last year. I can't see you, but raise your hands. Wave your hands to yourself if you were present. And this is what I'm imagining. I think we have even more than this, but isn't that a great picture? Don't you love that? That was San Diego. Last year, we're all together. We'd never even thought about COVID. And here we were, and it was just a great feeling. Bar audiences always excite me. I've told you this many times. You know, this is our 23rd. I think I missed one of these, so I've done it 22 times. Is there anyone listening? And if I guess you could put it in the chat for Alicia. And when we get to the Q&A, is there anyone who has been to all 23 that's here with us in this session right now? If you are, yay for you. And I won't go 22, 21, and so forth. But anyway, wow, it's an amazing phenomena. I want to also thank Bob for such a marvelous job as our new editor, and Sue and Jonathan and all the group I deal with all the time in the back pages of just getting things done. And also Herschel Shanks. You know, look what Herschel did in bridging the gap between the broad, diverse public, not just Christians, not just Jews, not just secularists, but everybody together. That's why I love a bar seminar. We got every phase of background and education. And also, you guys are the best read people that I've ever lectured to. I mean, I lecture all over the country, all over the world. Bar audiences are the best read. So not only do you have to keep on your toes and be careful and get everything right, but it's a pleasure to lecture on a little higher level. And even those of you that might not consider yourself as advanced to follow everything instantly, you know how to dig. I bet most of you are members of the BAS library. Boy, if you're not, the price is right. Bob did not tell me to do any of this salesmanship, by the way. I'm doing it because I believe in it. 23 years. Actually, I've been doing this for 29 years, working with Herschel and all the team, and I just love it. So a little self-promotion here. My blog is jamestabor.com, so if you can remember the name of the speaker, you got it. Please sign up for the blog. You'll get notices. I try to do 2 or 3 a week. I don't always make it lately because I've been teaching online and I'm so busy. During the summer of COVID, I published 2 other books. So Alicia didn't even have these yet. They were in process already. And so they're on Amazon. I did it with Amazon. So another book on Paul's Ascent to Paradise, based on my dissertation. God, how many years ago? Back in the 80s. And if you want to get that, they're available. And also, I translated the book of Genesis in a new kind of translation that you might enjoy. It's called the Transparent English Bible. And whether I'll live long enough to do the whole Bible, I don't know, but Genesis is fundamental. So write those down and order them if you'd like, and we'll go from there. I'm going to shut my door because I saw one of my kids just drove up. I'm at home right now. Sorry about that. Just because we have a dog that might bark. So I want to talk to you about what I'm going to call the most mysterious prophecy of the Bible. I hope that whets your interest. I first heard this from Robert Eisenman, this idea, and then I've developed it in ways different from him. But I was listening to him lecture at Qumran, the site of the Dead Sea Scrolls, way back in the early 1990s. We were doing some archaeological survey work. And you probably, if you've heard Eisenman, you know he refers to this often. But in the Jewish War, Josephus' Jewish War, the Jewish historian Josephus, he comes to a point where he says, I'm going to paraphrase till I get to this passage. He says something like, you know, the war is over. He's told the bloody story of how horrible it was. But he says, you know, our God is providential, and God always does things according to his will. And then he throws this in. So let me read this to you, read it with you. But what more than anything else incited them to war was an ambiguous oracle found in their sacred scriptures to the effect that at that time, one of their country would become ruler of the world. I'm going to see if my laser pointer will work on this screen. I don't think it will. Let me just try. I've never done this. I've never done a laser pointer on a computer screen. And I might not even have it here. But I want to point it.
James, I think if you use your mouse, we can see it.
Yeah, my mouse, though, doesn't seem to. See, I have it in full screen. I'll tell you what I can do. I can do this with my mouse. And I'll just make it larger. How's that?
There you go.
Yeah. If I can just stretch it larger. Yeah, I want to be able to. Is that still okay then? You've got this little side thing that's
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, great. So what more than all else incited them to war was an ambiguous oracle found in their sacred scriptures. So he's sort of writing to the Romans. What incited the Jews to war? And notice he says, what more than all else? You would think he might have said something like, you know, revolutionary fervor or the desire to be free, or any number of reasons people revolt from political domination and rule. But it's an oracle. But notice he says an ambiguous oracle. It's going to be hard to interpret. To the effect that, and here's the word right here, I'm talking about apocalypticism. At that time, one from their country would become ruler of the world. Now, all of you easily can discern that one from their country, meaning the Jewish people, the Israelite people, becoming ruler of the world, we call it the Messiah. So he's saying the main thing that affected my people, remember he's Jewish and he fought on the other side until he surrendered to the Romans. He was a general of Galilee in the early stages of the war. But notice what else he says. He doesn't just say, was the belief that they would have a Messiah that would rule the world, even rule the Romans, but notice, at that time. So he has in mind a text, an ambiguous oracle, he calls it, that actually, let's see if this will, I've got to figure out now, I have to, not sure I can, sorry, Bob, I've got to figure this out. If I have it in this mode, I'm going to have to do it like this. Okay, that's all right. I just want you to be able to see it, so it'll be okay. Now, this oracle apparently was widespread. Have you heard of Tacitus? He was a Roman historian into the first century, into the second. He writes the histories of Rome. We don't have it all, but we've got this precious little part of it. And Tacitus tells about the Jewish revolt against Rome, 63 to 73 CE. He says, some few put a fearful meaning on these events, but in most there was a firm persuasion that in the ancient records of their priests, that's how Tacitus, a Roman historian, would refer to the Bible or the Tanakh or the Hebrew scriptures. In the records of their priests was contained a prediction of how at this very time, same thing, this very time, the East was to grow powerful and rulers coming out of Judea were to acquire universal empire. These mysterious prophecies had pointed to Vespasian and Titus. I'm guessing he's getting this from Josephus, that this was the word out on the streets of Rome, that we've got this incredible oracle that Josephus is saying actually predicts the reign of Vespasian and Titus, even though the Jews, because it's ambiguous, thought it was their Messiah. In other words, the Bible predicts that Titus and Vespasian would conquer the Jews, not that the Jewish Messiah would conquer Rome. The people, notice the prejudice here, with the usual blindness of ambition, had interpreted these mighty destinies of themselves. And remember, he's writing for Rome, so you can see the sarcasm here, and cannot be brought even by disasters to believe the truth. So you beat the Jews down and you say, yeah, read your Bible again, read your scriptures again, because actually your scriptures predict our conquering you, not your conquering us. Isn't that interesting? Now look at this. Suetonius, our other source for the first century in terms of Roman historians, very gossipy guy. He loves to tell about all the scandals and he's kind of a salacious tell-all author. Loves to talk about sex and violence. Anyway, look at this though. He says, in the life of Vespasian, there had spread all over the Orient an old and established belief that it was fated at that time. Notice all three are talking about the time, not just what's going to happen, but at that time. What is it about this time? We got to find some kind of clock ticking that these people are referring to, these historians. For men coming from Judea would rule the world. This prediction referring to the emperor of Rome as afterwards appeared from the event, meaning if Vespasian won, it had to be about him. The people of Judea took to themselves, accordingly they revolted. Now, when I first came across this, Eisenman was talking about it and I looked at it. He didn't identify the oracle. I said, I have got to figure out, what are they talking about? Vespasian is Jewish. He's read the scriptures. He writes the antiquities of the Jews that goes verse by verse, chapter by chapter, through the whole Hebrew Bible as we know it. And I got to find, where is that mysterious oracle? I'm wondering if anybody can guess. If you can guess, put it in the chat now, and Alicia will later give you a reward. Okay, you ready? I think this is it. Now, don't glaze over. I could have put this on 3 slides, but I didn't, because we're going to pick things out of it and outline it. Some of you know this. Maybe you had an evangelical Christian background and this was used to prove Jesus was the Messiah and he came right on time. Or maybe you've studied it subsequently for other cultural reasons or religious reasons. Or maybe you've just puzzled over it. But in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, we have what we call usually the 70 weeks prophecy. And what it says is, it's purported to be from the time of Daniel, where Daniel is reading the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah had prophesied that after 70 years, the Jewish people would come back from Babylonian exile. Remember, they were exiled in 586. So in 70 years, maybe around 520 or so, they would begin to come back. Now, this prophecy, in effect, is saying to Daniel, you thought it was 70 years, it's actually 70 weeks of years. So what is a week of years? If 1 week of years would be 7 years, 2 would be 14, and so forth. So 70 weeks of years, it's actually the Hebrew is 70 heptads. So we're actually going to be counting weeks here, weeks of years. Well, 70 times 7 is 490, so keep 490 in mind. Now, what's going to happen? This is everything any Jew would have wanted, any pious Jew would have wanted in the Second Temple period. Come back, build the temple. You're going to finish, it literally means the punishment for transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity. In other words, all of the sins that brought on the exile will be over. Everlasting righteousness, vision and prophet will be all fulfilled, and you'll anoint a most holy place, the temple, or you can translate it, a most holy one. And then it breaks down. Know therefore from the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince. There will be 7 weeks. That would be 49 years. Then for 62 weeks, it'll be built again in squares and moat, but in a troubled time. Remember that word squares. We're going to come back to that. After 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. An anointed one could be a priest or a king. I wouldn't really translate it Messiah here because of later Christian connotations, but just, in other words, you're going to have your temple again, you're going to have your priesthood, you're going to have your kingship again. But here's the verse I want you to notice, or the phrase. And the prince of the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And then I'm going to skip down here. He will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. For half a week, he will cause sacrifice and offering to cease. On the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate. Maybe you remember in the Gospels, those of you that have studied Christianity a little bit, Jesus refers to this verse. So if you're glazing over now, I got a message from Jesus. You ready? You know what he says here? This is Gospel of Mark, chapter 13. He said, let the reader understand. It's the only time a text of Mark addresses you, the reader, and says, pay attention to this slide here. Look at this. Understand it. It's a little tough, but we'll break it down. Now, in the next slide, I break it down for you where it's a little easier. 490-year period. Everybody got that? It's divided into 3 parts. 49 years, 7 weeks. 434 years, 62 weeks. And 1 week, 7 years. A final week. And when the final week comes, you get the desolating sacrilege, as it's called in Mark, in the Gospel of Mark. Some sort of abomination that's going to be destructive and also very offensive. A desolating sacrilege means something so offensive to Jewish sensibilities and worship, but also very destructive. In other words, it's going to involve some sort of war and destroying the city and the sanctuary. And that's in a final 7-year period. So that's the sort of clock that gets set. Now, my hypothesis is that Josephus has this oracle in mind. And what he's arguing is this prince that is to come is not the Messiah the Jews were hoping for if they thought they were about 490 years from where this prophecy begins, but was actually the Roman emperor rather, Vespasian, the one who became the emperor, and his son Titus. So that's how Josephus, but he says that what really inspired the Jews to revolt was that about this time, there would be this complete fulfillment of their messianic dreams and hopes. Now, I want to trace this in 2 movements and then talk about what happens when prophecy fails. So we're going to use 2 examples, 2 ancient examples from the Second Temple period. It makes sense to do the Second Temple period because Josephus is writing about people who lived through that period and were inspired to revolt against Rome because of this ambiguous oracle in the Holy Scriptures. Okay. I'm taking Michael Wise's title of his book here because I love it so much. Michael wrote a book a few years ago called The First Messiah. You know, titles are pretty cool. And whenever you can have a title like this, Eric Klein is good at titles. Bob's got a pretty good title on his book. If you can get a really good title, it helps the book. So Wise called his book The First Messiah. And if I'm browsing through a bookstore and I see a book, The First Messiah, and especially if I'm Christian, and you know, the vast public, we're in a Christian culture, the book buying public, they're going to go, the first Messiah, is this about Jesus? Well, obviously, you say, well, are there like other Messiahs or whatever? So he's actually, if you remember, Israel Knoll published a book at the same time, same year, and he called it The Messiah Before Jesus, which is even more blatant. That's not a bad title either. And you could see how people would do a double take, like, wait, Jesus is the Messiah, but there was one before him. So yes, there was, if you want to call him Messiah. Anyway, Michael was willing to call him a Messiah, an anointed one, a chosen one. According to the scrolls, he's anointed of the Spirit, Isaiah 61. And we have a text about him. And the same thing was said about Jesus in Luke chapter 4. He's anointed of the Spirit. So what is he called? Well, you've heard of him. You guys, you people, you bar people, bass people, whatever we call you, you know the teacher of righteousness is how we usually translate it. You could translate it the true, the right, or the unique teacher. He's mentioned 30 times in the Dead Sea Scroll corpus. This is the line I want you to notice particularly. He's the one to whom God has made known all the mysteries of the words of his servants, the prophets. So the Dead Sea Scroll community, I'm just going to call them that. I'm not going to call them Essenes. I might call them the Qumran group. Since Dead Sea Scroll community is a big mouthful, I'm just going to say the Qumran group or the Dead Sea Scroll group. So the Dead Sea Scroll group, the Qumran group, they dated his demise, his appearing and his demise as fitting into this prophecy. I'm going to show you how. So they actually had a clock ticking. And I think the same is true with the Jesus followers. And I think they were both wrong because, well, we'll see. Okay. One of the, I put the references down below. I'm not going to go into the references so much like 1QS. It takes too much time. I've only got 50 minutes, 55 minutes here. And we got to get through some stuff. And don't look over here at all the slides we have to go. I'm just kidding you. We'll go through them quickly. What I want you to notice here in the community rule, this is the time for the preparation of the way in the wilderness. They're quoting Isaiah 40. The New Testament Gospel of Mark opens with this same quote and says, the time is fulfilled. It's time to prepare in the way in the wilderness. What is this time? I mean, you might have said, let's go prepare the way in the wilderness, or maybe we should prepare the way in the wilderness. But when you say this is the time for preparing the way in the wilderness, you got something in mind. And the master, this is not the teacher. This is simply the leader of the community before the teacher. He will teach them to do all that is required and separate from those who've not turned aside. And then it talks about they're going to depart from none of the counsels of Torah. They're going to walk in the primitive precepts of the men of the community when they were first instructed until there come the prophet. So because of a prophecy in Deuteronomy 18:15 about where God says, I'm going to raise up a prophet like Moses and you will listen to him. The Christians also quote this in the book of Acts, chapter 3, chapter 7. The book of Hebrews alludes to it. Paul alludes to it, that there's supposed to be another Moses figure. Now, in this text of the community rule, he hasn't come yet. Notice, until there come the prophet and the two messiahs. There's a priestly Messiah and a Davidic Messiah. These are the two messiahs that they're expecting. But notice it's three figures. They're expecting a prophet like Moses, and then a priest like Aaron, and a king like King David. Okay, so in the early days of the community, that Messiah had not come. Now, here's how we know they're into this chronology. Notice this. This is in the Damascus document, CD. He visited them. It talked about when the community first started, after 390 years. Now, look at this. They're counting years, 390 years. We're going to add this up down here. He visited them, and he caused meaning Israel. He visited Israel, and he caused a plant root to spring up from Israel and Aaron to inherit his land and prosper. They perceived their iniquity and recognized they were guilty men. So the Qumran group believes 390 years after being taken into Babylon. Remember, they're not using our year 586. So don't have a date in mind. Have the events in mind. So 390 years after the captivity, God raises up this root in the desert out at Qumran. I think it's Qumran. Let's say it's Qumran. A plant root springs up. And yet for 20 years, they're looking back. This is after the teacher's already come. And they say, we were like blind men groping for the way in the wilderness. We're trying to follow the way. They had certain halakhic observances that we know from MMT, the way that they thought the Torah was to be followed. They felt that those people up in Jerusalem were corrupt. They were guilty of immorality. They were guilty of greed and misinterpreting the Torah. They were not really God's people, even though they come back and built this temple. They're out in the desert preparing the way for the Lord to come, for Jehovah to come back, for Yahweh to come back. But God observed their deeds. They're a faithful group out in the desert, and they're seeking him with a whole heart. Jeremiah had said, if you seek me with the whole heart, you'll find me. And look what happened. He raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. So the teacher shows up 20 years, for 390 years they wander. Then after that, the community rises up, and for 20 years they're doing their best. But he says they're like blind men groping for the way. So that would be 410 years. That leaves us 80 years left of Daniel's 490. Remember, Daniel has the 490. Now, you might say, well, I don't know that they're using Daniel yet. Just wait, because I'm going to show you they are using Daniel. But anyway, when we get to the teacher, we got 80 years left. Now, we don't know how long the teacher lived or reigned, but we got a pretty good way of guessing, as I'll show you. Probably should have got a glass of water here. I'm pushing my voice, but that's okay. Now, what happens is the teacher came and went. I'm going to suggest down here that he probably ruled about 40 years. It might not be exact. It might be ideal. But remember, they think he's a prophet like Moses, and the Moses prophet led the people of Israel for 40 years in the wilderness. Now they're in the wilderness. They have the prophet like Moses. Whether they had it exact or not, I don't know. But in their idealization, that's the way it worked. And when we get to Jesus, you're going to see something kind of similar. Anyway, none of the men who entered the new covenant in the land of Damascus and betray it. Once the teacher died, people began to betray. There was a liar who rose up. He's called the liar. And he is within the community. The teacher says in the community, in the Thanksgiving hymns that are autobiographical, some of them, he says, the one who dipped his bread in the bowl with me has lifted up his heel against me. You say, Dr. Tabor, you're getting mixed up. You're quoting the New Testament. No, I'm quoting the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, because Jesus said the same thing at the Last Supper. Now, is Jesus copying the teacher? No, I don't think so. It's a psalm that you can have an intimate friend within your community, and he leaves and rebels and starts his own group. Happens in almost every apocalyptic community. You get these splits. And so he's called the liar down here. And so he let off people. But what this text is saying, if you betray the new covenant and depart from the fountain of living waters, I take that as the teacher's teaching. It's like living waters. Does that remind you of anything in the New Testament? I think so. So if you depart from the fountain, you need to listen to the teacher, even though he's gone. You will be reckoned with the counsel of the people. And depart it shall be there might be, maybe I need a note here. Oh, none, sorry. None of the men shall be reckoned with the counsel of the people are inscribed in the book. The book is the book of life. You're going to be blotted out of the book. Notice, from the day of the gathering in of the teacher, here he's called the unique teacher. Isn't that interesting? The one and only teacher. There's one way, this teacher. So if you depart from the teacher, from his gathering in, that means his death. We think he might have even been killed, but we're not sure. But he was definitely persecuted, and the scrolls refer to that. Until the comings of the Messiah of Aaron and Israel. Remember, when the kingdom of God comes, you have these two Messiahs, priestly, perfect priest, perfect king. But the teacher in the meantime is gone, and the Messiahs are not coming. So it's basically a warning. You better hold fast. You better hold faithfully to the living waters that you learn from the teacher, because if you depart from it, then you're going to be blotted out of the book. But here, notice this. This is where we can hook it into the 70 weeks prophecy. From the gathering of the unique teacher, I love how they're calling him the Yaqid, the one and only, the one and only, the one and only teacher, until the end of all the men who deserted to the liar. So all you guys that left us with that liar, we don't know his name, you've only got 40 years left. Now, how could they possibly say that within 40 years? Because here they talk about, well, you'll see here that from his gathering until the coming is the Messiah, but here that puts here it puts a time on it. Though it passed, but notice it's about 40 years, about 40 years, okay? Now, this is from the New Testament, but I'm going to paraphrase here and say, if I read this, I would paraphrase this as saying to you, if you're in the community, this generation shall not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. You're the generation of the end. You're going to live to see the end time. So 390 years, Israel's in exile. For 20 years, the community begins to gather things together. For 40 years, the teacher lives. There's now about 40 years left. And then it's going to become the judgment. Okay? How did that work? Now, notice this. This is from 4Q. This is from K4. It's this precious little fragment. When we found this and it got published, it helped me to put all this together. Remember how we waited to get all the unpublished scrolls out? A little while and the wicked will be no more. Hey, if I told you everything is going to be perfect within one generation, in your generation, you're going to live to see it. It's pretty exciting. Every apocalyptic group has thrived on this from the beginning. I will look towards his place, but he will not be there. This is Psalm 37. So it's what we call a pesher or interpretation of a scripture. Pesher just means interpretation. It is interpreted. Psalm 37 has a verse. This is the verse. A little while and the wicked will be no more. Well, they took it and applied it to their own community and said, well, how long is a little while? Well, here's the interpretation. And I think they probably got this from the teacher or one of his successors. Maybe they had an apostle Paul, or maybe they had the equivalent of someone else who came after the teacher. What does this verse really mean? What is the hidden meaning of this verse? This concerns all the wicked. At the end of 40 years, they shall be blotted out and not a man shall be found on the earth. Because you're going to have a new heavens and new earth created. So they've got this final 40-year period. It's like a countdown period. Now, the way, this is brilliant. Be sure you follow this. It gets a little complicated, but you can follow it. Think about a Jubilee cycle, because we're going to talk about the Jubilees. The Jubilee for this group is 49 years. I know we also sometimes say it's 50 years, but I think a number of scholars have written about this. In the Second Temple period, it tends to be 49 years, and then you end it on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and that begins the first year of the new year, counting 7 for the sabbatical years. And so just remember, Jubilee is 49 years. Now, this group began to think, well, wait a minute. If the whole period of Daniel is 490 years, 70 weeks, that's 10 Jubilees. So we can actually talk about Jubilees. They're 10, 50, 49-year periods, and then we're going to have the end. Some of you know books like the Book of Jubilees that gets into this sort of thing, and they're working out a very similar chronology, although that book has a little different theme than these texts. Now, here's another fragment. This was in Cave 11. This is so valuable. This has been published for a number of years now. It's called 11Q Melch, which means Melchizedek. It talks about, it actually tells us where they thought they were when they wrote this text. The teacher's gone, and it says this thing in the context for proclaiming liberty to the captives. Do you remember in Luke 4, Jesus stands up in the synagogue at Nazareth, where he was brought up? He opens the scroll to Isaiah 61. He says, the Lord has anointed me. And then he reads the different things that the Messiah is going to do, preach good news to the poor, heal the sick, raise the dead, and so forth. That's also a text in the scrolls, very similar text. So notice this though. And then it ends with proclaiming liberty to the captives and sight to the blind. So the liberty of the captives is understood as, remember, Jubilee is to free the whole world from debt, not just the land of Israel. In other words, you're going to bring in everlasting righteousness. You're going to just start a new epic. So there's a final countdown of 490 years, 10 Jubilees. And the Day of Atonement is the end of the 10th Jubilee, when all the sons of light and the men of the lot of Melchizedek will be atoned for. So when that final Jubilee ends, which will be the end of the 490 years, that's the year of the grace for Melchizedek. Melchizedek was this heavenly priest that they believed in. Now, if you plug this in, look what you've got. 490 years, you got 10 Jubilees, 490 years. We can actually calculate within a year or two where they thought they were. Now, I can't give you a date. I'm talking about how close to the end they thought. The first week following the ninth, okay, 441 years would be 9 times 49 plus 7. So during the first week following the ninth, you would finally have the year of grace coming, leaving 42 years of the 490 total. That's why I think it says about 40 years. So when the teacher died, they probably waited a year or two, and then they're looking at their calculations. And remember, they don't need a date. They have the death of their teacher. From the death of the teacher until the destruction of everything will be about 40 years. So we have to read the Dead Sea Scrolls with this in mind. Any of the scrolls written after the death of the teacher, they're the community of the last days. Not in a general sense. They think they literally are counting off the final years of the end of the age. Yeah, got to really hurry here. Now, this text is very important. It's a commentary on Habakkuk. It says he did not make known to him when the end would come, but it's going to come speedily. This means that the teacher of righteousness, he knew all the mysteries, but he didn't make known to Habakkuk, the Old Testament, this is the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, the exact time. For still the vision awaits. The blue is Habakkuk, this is the interpretation. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. Meaning the vision of Daniel 9, it's not going to lie. It means the final age shall be prolonged and shall exceed all that the prophets have said. If it tarries, wait for it, it will surely come, it will not be late. Okay, what's going to happen? You're going to get past your 40 years. And what happens? Well, in this case, finally the Romans come in 70, but this community is probably 1st century BC, and they have to have decades and decades with the prophecy not getting fulfilled. And they had said that all the men of Belial are going to be destroyed and all the wicked are going to be destroyed. But there is a prophecy in Habakkuk that if it tarries, wait for it, meaning prophecy can take longer than even Daniel knew. This is one of the strategies of when prophecy fails, as you're going to see in a minute. The final age is prolonged. For all the ages of God reach their appointed end as he determines. This is one of the strategies of dealing with failed apocalyptic. You thought it was your interpretation. And actually, they don't say they're wrong. Notice, they don't say they're wrong. They say we have more than 490 years. It's up to God if he wants to give us more time. In the book of Acts, the disciples asked Jesus, will you at this time restore the kingdom of God to Israel? Chapter 1. He says, it's not for you to know the times and the seasons. Very similar idea. God will work out exactly the time. Now, what if you are puffed up and arrogant and you say, well, then the prophecy's wrong? Then you're going to be wicked and you will be destroyed. But look at this, the righteous shall live by faith. Now, Paul quotes that to mean the blood atonement of Jesus in Romans 3, right, and 4. How do they interpret it? This means those who observe the Torah, whom God will deliver from the house of judgment because of their suffering, because they're being taunted and made fun of, and their faith in the teacher of righteousness. You see how they actually have faith in the teacher of righteousness. You see that? Okay, now I want to leave you some time for questions, and you know the Jesus movement pretty well, so I'm basically going to run a parallel. Real quick, we'll take like a minute to go through this. We just got a few slides. After John is arrested, Mark, our earliest gospel, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand. Same thing, time is fulfilled. This is the time. Galatians 4, Paul, when the time had fully come. What is this time business? Something about the time. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, that you should not, he thinks he's living in some sort of final 40-year period. I believe that the early Christians came to believe that following the death of Jesus would be about 40 years. Jesus died in 30, let's say, about 40 years, gets you to 70. And a prince who is to come destroyed the city and the sanctuary, right? You can see, we're going to see that in a minute. But notice here, he says, brethren, don't even get married. If you have a wife, fine, but if you're free from a wife, stay free. It's probably better. The appointed time has grown very short. You don't use that phrase, appointed time, and the form of this world is passing away, unless you think there's some sort of timetable and you're very near the end. Now, in the synoptic apocalypse of Mark that I mentioned earlier, Jesus refers to this prophecy. When you see the desolating sacrilege standing where it ought not to be, then you get out of Judea, you flee. There's going to be this terrible time of trouble. And after that time of trouble, the sun will be darkened, the stars will fall, the powers of heaven shaken, Son of Man will be coming in the clouds of heaven. This generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. I'm almost finished here. Luke comes along when prophecy fails, because clearly that generation did pass, and the Son of Man didn't come in the clouds of heaven and gather the elect from the four corners of the world. And Paul talks about rising to meet the Lord in the air and will ever be with the Lord and so forth. And notice here, Luke gives it a historical preterist interpretation. He says that was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. That wasn't the end. The end will come later after the times of the Gentiles. So now we got a potential gap. You can throw out Daniel 9. Daniel 9 is not about the end of the age. It's about the destruction of Jerusalem. You guys got it wrong. But he does still think it's pretty soon, because he says this generation will not pass away. So, final slide. What do you do when prophecy fails, especially if you're locked into this kind of timetable? One thing is you can reinterpret the date or the chronological scheme, right? You can just reinterpret it. You can just begin to say, well, we thought it was this, but we've recalculated and we started the 70 weeks at the wrong time. Let's move it here. And now we've got some more time. You can do that sort of thing. I think during the time of Qumran and the time of Paul, they pretty well had thought of it as that final Jubilee period. They probably are also working with some kind of scheme. All I have to go on that is Mark 13. This generation will not pass away. And he writes that probably around 70 or a little after 70. And also Paul saying the appointed time has grown very short. And he's telling people not even to get married. So it is that generation. The other thing you could do is assert things were fulfilled after all in a different way. You can simply, what Qumran did, by the way, is they didn't reset the date, but they reset the chronological scheme, almost like stop that clock. And now it's just up to God, because the times of God are not the times of us. You can also claim that things did happen. I think Luke is doing that with Mark. He's saying it happened. Vespasian came in. He set up the desolating sacrilege, a statue to Zeus in the temple. He destroyed the city and the sanctuary. What else do you want? And so it didn't lead to the end of the world, in fact, or the end of the age. Rome asserted itself with all more power and so forth after that happened. The third scheme is the one that the church eventually took up. Not every group all through the ages, but it tends to be the safest. It's just abandon apocalyptic schemes and timetables. If you read the Talmud, Sanhedrin 98, I really recommend it. The rabbis talk about all the possible schemes. And you know what they say at the end? Very similar to the Habakkuk Pesher. They say, basically, it's wide open now. It could come anytime. We have no idea. So for a brief period of time, leading to the Jewish revolt, according to Josephus, what most spurred them to revolt was this prophecy about the time. And I think the two main movements that we know, the Qumran movement and the John the Baptist Jesus movement, were really locked into this. And when it failed to happen, when Rome did destroy Jerusalem, and the end did not come, and the Son of Man did not appear. I'm thinking that basically, I'm going to stop the screen sharing where I can just look at you. I think basically various moves were made, but the broad move that was made is that the end can come anytime. If you look, there's still expectations maybe of some sort of repeat desolating sacrilege, something like we have today with the dispensationalists. You get that in the Didache, for example, where they talk about a evil ruler will come. But once Jerusalem is destroyed and there's no temple, it's very hard to track these prophecies very literally again. And so the tendency through the ages is to kind of spiritualize them. Well, the kingdom of God did come, but it wasn't David coming back or the Messiah of David ruling on earth and so